Sweetwater was the kind of dusty frontier town where everyone knew everyone else's business, except, strangely, Eleanor Hayes's. People spoke about her far more often than they ever spoke to her. At 29, she was considered the old maid, a woman left behind by life, by youth, by love. She lived alone in a small cabin tucked into the pines a mile from town, teaching school children their letters in the mornings and returning to her. Quiet solitude before nightfall. It wasn't that Eleanor disliked people. She just never belonged among them. Men looked past her. Women pitied her. And the children she taught, well, they were the only ones who smiled at her without judgment. Still, she made her peace with smallness. A life could be lived in the hush between one day and the next, but Sweetwater was about to break its hush. The winter storm rolled in without warning, one of those wild, furious blizzards that howled across the plains and slammed into the mountains with a vengeance. It was the kind of cold that could bury a man alive, the kind that swallowed horses whole. Fires were stoked high in every home. Doors were bolted. People huddled close, and into that storm rode 3 town men half frozen and panicked, dragging behind them a wounded Apache warrior. He was strong even in captivity. His hands were bound, his shoulder bleeding from a rifle shot, his jaw clenched with a fury that could scorch through snow. No one in Sweetwater dared look at him for long. Their stories had painted Apaches as savages, devils, beasts who'd sooner cut a throat than speak a word. But Eleanor, standing on the edge of Main Street with a basket of coal, caught his eyes just once as they dragged him past, and something inside her stilled. His eyes weren't wild. They weren't cruel. They were tired, proud, human. The town men fought the wind all the way to the sheriff's office, only to discover that the jail cell roof had half collapsed from snow weight. There was no safe place to keep the Apache. They argued, cursed, shoved. The storm only grew worse, making it too dangerous to ride out to Fort Graham for help. Then someone said the words that changed everything. Eleanor's old hunting cabin is empty. Her spine went rigid. She hadn't set foot in that cabin since her father's death. It was barely more than a shelter, cold, drafty, simple. But it was standing. And more importantly, it locked from the outside. Before she could speak, protest, or even think, the men had decided. "We'll put him there until morning," they said. "Storm should pass. Then we'll get that Apache to the fort." They didn't ask Eleanor's permission. The town never asked her much of anything. They simply ordered her to fetch blankets and whatever supplies she could spare. While they dragged the warrior up the narrow path toward the woods, by the time she reached the cabin, breathless from the climb and from a dread she didn't yet understand, the men had already shoved him inside. The door slammed. The padlock snapped shut, and the echoes of their boots faded into the snowstorm. Eleanor stood alone, the cold slicing through her shawl. She could hear his breathing on the other side of the door, ragged, pained, but steady. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't speak. She pressed her gloved hand to the rough wood and whispered, not expecting an answer, "I'm here." It was the smallest sentence, but it was the first crack. In the quiet life she thought she would die. Living. The cabin was dim when Eleanor finally mustered the courage to lift the latch and step inside. The wind shoved at her back as if urging her to hurry, and she slipped through the doorway, closing it quickly behind her. The storm's roar dulled to a distant growl, replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the soft crackle of old logs in the hearth. Her father had built the cabin as a hunting shelter, one room. One cot, one fireplace, and a table whose legs wobbled with age. It was never meant for 2 people, let alone people who didn't trust each other, especially when one of them was an Apache. He sat in the far corner, back against the wall, arms bound at the wrists with thick rope. His long black hair was matted with melting snow, strands clinging to the raw wound in his shoulder. Blood had streaked down his chest, freezing in the cold air. His breathing was slow, controlled, the kind of breathing a man did when pain became an old companion. He didn't look at her. Not at first. Eleanor swallowed hard, her heart striking her ribs. She had seen native men from a distance before, mostly during the raids of her childhood, but never this close. Never long enough to study the details. His jaw was sharp, strong, and unyielding. His skin, even pallid with cold, held a deep bronze warmth. And his eyes, he opened them suddenly as if he sensed her gaze, and the force of them nearly rooted her to the floor. Dark, sharp, a storm behind a storm. He didn't flinch, didn't shift, just watched her, silent and unbroken. Eleanor took a small step forward, clutching the folded blankets to her chest. "I brought these," she whispered, then felt foolish immediately. The man was half frozen, half bleeding. Blankets were the bare minimum. He didn't respond. She moved carefully, as if approaching a wounded wolf. "I'm going to put these by the fire. You'll freeze otherwise." When she passed him, even at a distance, she could feel the weight of his stare following her. Not hateful, not wild, just observing, studying, like he was trying to understand why the townsman had left him in the care of a delicate woman, who clearly feared him. She knelt by the fire, adding wood to the open hearth, coaxing the flames higher the way her father had taught her. The warmth began to seep into the room, making the shadows shift, making the Apache's expression more visible. He was watching her hands, her small, trembling, white-gloved hands working to build him warmth. "You're hurt," she said softly. "Your shoulder needs tending." Still nothing. She took a slow breath. "If I don't clean it, you might not live until morning." That made him shift just a fraction, but enough to tell her he understood the words. When she turned, she saw the tightness around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He was in pain. He was exhausted, and he trusted her no more than she trusted him. Eleanor crawled a little closer, stopping well out of his reach. She held up the claws she'd brought, along with a small tin of salve. "May I?" she asked, voice barely more than a breath, for a long moment. He didn't move. Then so subtly she almost didn't catch it. He gave the smallest nod. Her heart leapt, but she forced her hands to steady. She approached slowly, untying her gloves and rolling up her sleeves. The closer she came, the more she could smell the cold on him, the pine, the iron scent of blood. When she pressed the cloth to his wound, he didn't make a sound, though his entire body went rigid. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I'm trying to help." His eyes locked onto hers again. This time, something flickered there, something not sharp or guarded, but curious. She finished cleaning the wound as best she could and wrapped it tightly. He watched every movement. When she pulled back, putting space between them again, he touched the bandage with his fingertips as if surprised it was real. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. And for the first time, the Apache spoke. His voice was deep, rough, yet steady. "Why?" The single word struck her far deeper than she expected. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. For Eleanor, the days in the cabin began with quiet routines. She stirred the coals, melted snow for water, and prepared thin gruel over the fire. Every sound, the hiss of steam, the snap of the logs, even the sigh of wind outside felt magnified in the small cabin. And all the while, Taza watched. Silent, unblinking, as if her every movement was a lesson he had to learn. At first, Eleanor worried he was studying her to judge her, to confirm the town's stories that white women were weak and unworthy. But the more she observed him, the more she noticed subtle shifts. His eyes softened when she added extra wood to the fire. They followed her fingers when she stirred the pot. Once, He even tilted his head slightly when she hummed a tune she remembered from her childhood, soft trembling, almost forgotten. Eleanor began to speak to him in fragments, careful words. "You must be hungry." "I can make tea," she whispered. "Your shoulder." At first, he ignored her. Then, one evening, when the storm outside rattled the cabin with a furious wind, he spoke for the first time beyond that single word. "Eleanor?" His voice was hesitant, testing. She jumped, startled that he had remembered her name. "Yes?" She answered, voice trembling in the cold, in the uncertainty of being heard by someone so strong, so unlike the people she knew. "You? Why alone?" His English was broken but understandable, each word deliberate. Eleanor froze. The question carried no judgment, no mockery. Just curiosity. And something about the way he asked, with a quiet authority that didn't demand an answer, made her heart ache. How could she explain decades of being overlooked? Of being seen but never truly noticed? I don't belong," she whispered finally. "Not here. Not there. I teach. I live alone." Taza regarded her silently for a long moment, eyes dark, thoughtful. He seemed to measure her words against the truth in her eyes. Then he said, in his broken English, "No." "Same. What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, startled. He looked away for a moment, as if translating thoughts between worlds. "My people. Sometimes. Don't see me. Only my strength. Only my anger." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Here, in the dim cabin with the firelight flickering across the walls, she realized the Apache, like her, had been invisible in a way that left scars deeper than the ones anyone could see. She imagined the townspeople looking at him and only seeing a dangerous warrior, not the human beneath. And now, here in the cabin, he could see her, the quiet, frightened, lonely woman, and somehow he understood. A fragile connection began to take root. Eleanor no longer spoke only to break the silence. She spoke to be heard. Taza no longer remained silent just to resist. Sometimes he answered in words, sometimes in gestures. Small and deliberate a hand adjusting a blanket for her warmth, a nod when she completed a task. An approving glance that made her chest tighten. Days passed in this unspoken rhythm. Eleanor fed him, kept him warm, and offered the smallest kindnesses she could. He accepted them cautiously, with a dignity that made her respect him in return. And every night, when she lay on her cot, she imagined the world outside the cabin harsh, judgmental, and cruel, but in here. In this shared space of survival and quiet understanding, Eleanor finally felt seen. Not by the town, not by her family, not even by herself, but by someone who knew what it meant to be invisible and still survive. By the end of the third day, Eleanor realized she had stopped thinking of Taza as the Apache everyone feared. He was just a man, a wounded, proud, dangerous, human man who had entered her world unasked and already changed it forever. And she, the woman no one noticed, was beginning to notice him. The storm showed no mercy. Snowdrifts piled higher than Eleanor's waist, and the wind cut through the cabin walls like a knife. Outside, Sweetwater seemed swallowed by white, a place both unreachable and forgotten. Inside, the small room they shared grew tighter with each passing day. Every inch of space pressing them closer together, not physically, always, but in necessity. Eleanor had never imagined herself relying on anyone. She was self-sufficient, proud of her quiet independence. But when Taza began to cough a deep, wet, chilling sound that shook his whole body, she dropped everything to fetch boiling water, clean rags, and the small tin of salve she'd hidden from the townsmen. Her hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the strange, unfamiliar surge of care she felt for him. He watched her without words. letting her tend his wounds, guiding her with subtle gestures. Tilt the cloth here, pull tighter there, tilt the water just so. She followed him, amazed at the precision in each motion, impressed and frightened by the knowledge that this man could survive anything except, perhaps, exposure or neglect. Food became another lesson in trust and dependency. Their meager supplies of flour, dried meat, and a handful of beans had to last longer than either would have expected. Eleanor taught him how to stretch meals. He taught her which roots and wild herbs could supplement the gruel, how to melt snow in a way that preserved minerals, how to make a fire burn hotter with less wood. Each day was an exercise in patience. He was proud, quiet, and wary. She was frightened, methodical, and cautious. But together, their survival became a rhythm, a fragile partnership forged in necessity. She began to rely on his strength to move the heavier logs for the fire, to lift the buckets of water from the frozen creek nearby. He began to rely on her gentleness to tend the small wounds, to prepare food, to keep the cabin livable. By night, when the wind rattled the walls and snow pressed against the windows, their shared silences became more meaningful. Eleanor would sit near the fire, hands cupped around the warmth, and Taza would watch her, sometimes tilting his head, sometimes adjusting the blankets to keep the draft from reaching her. Neither spoke much, for words seemed heavy and unnecessary. But each action, each glance, each careful motion was a form of conversation. And slowly, Eleanor discovered another truth. She trusted him. Not the townspeople, not the sheriff, not the men who dragged him into her cabin, but Taza. She trusted him to keep her safe from the wind, from the snow, from hunger, and even from herself. And Taza, in his quiet way, began to trust her. Her care was clumsy, hesitant, but unwavering. She did not shrink from his presence. She did not flinch at his gaze. She treated him as a man, not a beast or a prisoner. One evening, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls, Eleanor paused mid-task and glanced at him. He was kneeling by the cot, cleaning his weapons, a ritual she assumed, more for comfort than necessity. The flickering light caught the sharp angles of his face, the curve of his jaw, the slight tension around his eyes that spoke of constant vigilance. And for the first time, she saw beyond the warrior, the danger, the savage tailies of the townspeople. She saw the man, proud, strong, wounded, and alive. She realized then that the storm, which had seemed like a curse, had forced them into each other's lives. In a world that had always ignored her, he was beginning to see her. And in a world that had always sought to cage him, she was beginning to be someone he could allow himself to rely upon. The wind outside roared louder than ever. But for the first time, Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It came from the quiet understanding that they were no longer alone, two people surviving together, learning to depend on each other in a harsh, merciless world. And for the first time, she felt something dangerous stir inside her. Hope. By the middle of the storm, the cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a small, fragile world suspended between snowdrifts and silence, where every glance and gesture carried weight far heavier than the walls could contain. Eleanor and Taza had settled into an unspoken routine, one born of survival, but now anew. Unfamiliar tension lingered in the air, one that neither dared name aloud. Eleanor noticed it first in the quiet moments. When she stirred the fire, he would shift his gaze to follow her hands, lingering longer than necessity demanded. When she brought a fresh bowl of gruel, he would meet her eyes and tilt his head as if offering silent acknowledgement. She felt it in the brush of his hands when he adjusted a blanket or passed her a ladle, small touches that carried the weight of intention. Though carefully restrained. Taza, for his part, was a study in controlled contradictions. His body was taut with the reflexes of a warrior trained for violence. Yet around Eleanor, he moved with a gentleness that seemed almost foreign. Each time she stumbled on a log or fumbled with her small tasks, he was there, not commanding, not scolding, simply steadying her, offering a strength that was at once physical and protective. And each time he watched her sleep by the fire, a flicker of something softer crossed his eyes, something that contradicted the stoicism of his warrior's mask. For Eleanor, the transformation was even more disorienting. She had lived so long invisible to the world, dismissed and overlooked, that she had never imagined anyone could notice her, truly notice her. Yet here was this man wounded, proud, and dangerous who did. Every moment she looked at him, she felt exposed, seen, and strangely safe. Her heart raced in ways that frightened her more than the storm ever could. One night, the wind howled against the cabin walls with a ferocity that made the small structure groan. Eleanor had dozed by the fire, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Taza, kneeling nearby, glanced at her and hesitated. Then, in a motion so subtle she almost didn't notice, he leaned forward and draped his own blanket over her shoulders, tucking the corners carefully. The warmth seeped into her, but more than that, it was the weight of his attention, the intimacy of his care. That made her heart flutter. She stirred and opened her eyes, meeting his gaze for the first time in the quiet dark. The firelight reflected in his deep, dark eyes, revealing something unexpected, curiosity perhaps, and something closer to longing. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. No words passed between them, none were needed. The storm raged outside, but inside, the cabin was still. Eleanor's hands fidgeted with the blanket. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't reply, only inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgment, and returned his attention to the fire. But the moment lingered, an unspoken shift in their connection. Trust had deepened into something more complicated, more dangerous. Affection. Days passed, and with the storm's slow retreat, they found themselves moving in closer rhythms, the space between them shrinking without their permission. She depended on him for safety, warmth, and guidance. He depended on her for care, stability, and companionship. Every glance, every gesture, every small act of kindness began to carry a new weight, a quiet intimacy that neither dared name. Yet neither could ignore. Eleanor realized one evening, as she handed him a cup of tea, that she no longer saw him only as the Apache the town feared. He had become something else entirely, a man who saw her, who understood her, who had begun to stir feelings inside her that frightened and thrilled her all at once. And Taza, in his silent, measured way, began to crave her presence in return, the warmth of her voice, the steady rhythm of her hands, the small courage she summoned just by being herself. In the long, frozen nights of the storm, the boundaries between protector and protected, teacher and student, stranger and companion began to blur. By the time the snow started to soften and the first hints of spring crept toward the mountains, both of them realized a dangerous truth. They could no longer imagine life without the other. What had begun as necessity, as survival, was becoming something infinitely more complex, more urgent, and infinitely more impossible to resist. Spring was still weeks away, but the storm had finally begun to loosen its grip. Snowdrifts melted into icy streams, and the wind softened to a persistent whistle rather than a roar. Eleanor had begun to think of the world outside the cabin as distant, almost imaginary. She and Taza had settled into a fragile rhythm of survival, of quiet companionship. Yet nothing could shield them from the truth that waited beyond the forest. The town would not forgive the Apache, and it would not let him leave unchallenged. The first sign came in the late afternoon, a distant clatter of hooves on frozen ground. Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the sound. 3 of Sweetwater's men, riding hard and shouting, cutting through the thinning snow like hunters closing in on prey. She instinctively moved closer to Taza, who had risen from his crouch by the fire, muscles tensing beneath his wound. "They found us," Eleanor whispered, voice trembling. They want me dead," Taza interrupted, his English clipped, deliberate. He did not shout. He did not panic. But his eyes, always sharp, now gleamed with something Eleanor had never seen. A controlled fury dot by the time the men reached the edge of the clearing. Eleanor had thrown a thick blanket over her shoulders and stood in front of the cabin, blocking the doorway. She was pale, shaking, but unyielding. One of the men, the sheriff's brother, dismounted and called out, "Bring him out, Hayes, or we'll drag him out ourselves." Eleanor's hands clenched around the wooden doorframe. "He's not leaving," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Not while I stand here." The men laughed, a cruel, hard sound that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "You'd throw yourself in front of an Apache for the town's old maid?" One sneered. "That's pathetic." "Hayes, perhaps," Eleanor said, lifting her chin. "But I'd rather die than let you kill him." Taza stepped forward. The movement slow, deliberate, his injured shoulder swaying but his stance unbroken. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the cabin door. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Outside, the men were armed and impatient. Inside, the wind rattled the cabin walls. Between them, a fragile woman had taken a stand that no one expected. Then Taza spoke, his voice low, deliberate, each word carrying authority that silenced the men more effectively than bullets ever could. "Go. Leave," he said in English, thick but unmistakable. "I stay." "She stay." The sheriff's brother stepped forward, raising his rifle, but Taza's eyes met his, unwavering, sharp as the steel in his hands. There was no hesitation, no fear, only the certainty of a man who had been hunted all his life and refused to be hunted any longer. Eleanor's chest tightened. She realized that in the weeks they had shared the cabin, she had seen him at his most vulnerable and his most powerful, and both were terrifying in their own way. And now, standing together, the two of them formed a line no one could cross without consequence. The men muttered, exchanged uncertain glances, then, slowly, reluctantly, turned their horses around. The sheriff's brother spat on the snow and muttered curses under his breath. But they left, their threat unresolved, the forest swallowing them once again. Eleanor exhaled, the tension leaving her body in a shuddering sigh. Taza turned to her, his dark eyes softer now, the firelight reflecting a quiet gratitude and something more, something she could almost feel but not yet name. "You." "Strong," he said, his English halting. "Very strong." "I'm not just strong," she whispered, her lips trembling. "I'm not letting you die." For a moment, the world outside the cabin, hostile, cruel, relentless, felt distant, almost imaginary. Inside, Eleanor and Taza had become more than survivor and protector. They were partners, defenders, and slowly, unspoken, something closer than either of them had dared to imagine. The snow softened outside, and for the first time, Eleanor realized that the danger had not broken them. It had drawn them closer. And when Taza rested his hand briefly on hers, she understood whatever came next. She would not face it alone. The night after the town men rode away, Eleanor lay awake by the fire, listening to the whisper of the wind through the pines. She had thought the danger was over, but Taza knew better. The men of Sweetwater were patient, relentless, and greedy for revenge. Staying in the cabin was no longer an option. "We leave," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He didn't ask. There was no argument to be had. Eleanor understood. Survival, he had taught her, often required swift, decisive action. Snow still blanketed the forest, crusted with ice and treacherous underfoot. Eleanor bundled herself in every spare blanket she could find, shivering from anticipation and fear, and followed Taza into the night. He moved with the ease of a mountain cat, careful, deliberate, scanning the terrain while keeping her in the shadow of his presence. Each step was measured, yet urgent, the kind of urgency born of knowing hunters were already tracing their scent out. At first, Eleanor stumbled. Roots, hidden beneath the snow, caught her feet. She tripped over the frozen brush, heart leaping, fear threatening to undo the careful courage she had summoned. Taza's hand shot out before she fell, his fingers gripping her wrist and pulling her close. Heat radiated from his body, strong and steady, and she felt the strange, intoxicating reassurance of his strength. "You safe," he said in a voice that was both command and promise. "Trust me." She nodded, though trust came slowly. Every instinct told her to run, to hide, to escape the weight of her own fear. But as she looked up at him, she saw something more compelling than danger, a certainty that he would not let harm touch her, not if he could help it. The forest was a maze of shadows and frozen streams. Taza led her through narrow ravines, over fallen logs, and across ice-laden rivers that cracked underfoot. Eleanor's muscles screamed in protest, but he guided her with a steady hand and careful words, teaching her how to navigate the treacherous terrain. When the cold threatened to numb her fingers, he pressed his mittened hands to hers. When exhaustion made her stumble, he lifted her without hesitation. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath boots and the distant call of a night bird. The world beyond the forest, the town, the cruel whispers, the guns, seemed to shrink with each step deeper into the wild. Here, in the shadows of the pines, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar thrill, the raw, untamed freedom of the land, and the even stranger realization that she was not alone in it. At one point, she glanced at him. He was watching her with quiet attention, eyes scanning her, the path, the horizon. His face was unreadable, dark against the moonlight, yet she felt the intensity of his presence pressing against her heart. For a moment, she wondered how a man so fierce, so untouchable, could also hold such gentleness and patience for her. They finally stopped in a small clearing, the moon spilling silver over the snow. Eleanor's breath came in shaky clouds. Taza knelt beside her, offering her a small share of the rations he had stashed, and waited until she ate. Then, wordlessly, he wrapped a spare blanket around her shoulders. "I carry you," he said simply. His tone matter-of-fact, as if there were no other option. And in that moment, Eleanor understood the depth of his devotion. He was not just a protector. He was someone she could rely on with her life. She didn't know what awaited them beyond the mountains, beyond the dangers of Sweetwater, but for the first time in her life, she felt something like hope, and it came not from herself, but from him. They moved again, into the darkness, toward an uncertain safety. Eleanor clung to him not out of fear, but out of the strange, growing awareness that she would follow him anywhere. And Taza, silent and strong, welcomed her trust, carrying her through the wild with a quiet determination that spoke of more than survival. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the forest, Eleanor realized that whatever awaited them in the world beyond the trees, they would face it together. By the time they reached the higher ridges of the mountains, the first signs of spring were beginning to creep through the melting snow. Tiny green shoots poked through the white, streams ran freer, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing earth. For Eleanor, every new sound, every bright glimmer of sunlight, was a shock after weeks of relentless winter. But the wonder of the season was overshadowed by a more pressing reality. Taza's homeland lay ahead, a place she had never seen and could barely imagine. The journey had been arduous. Eleanor's muscles ached from climbing. Her hands were raw from gripping ice-laden rocks, and her feet were blistered from frozen boots. Yet, through it all, Taza remained a constant, unwavering presence lifting her when exhaustion threatened to topple her, guiding her over treacherous terrain and guarding her with a vigilance that made her feel both safe and uncomfortably aware of how dependent she had become on him. Finally, they arrived at the edge of a small settlement within his people's territory. The Apache watched silently from the tree line as Eleanor stared at the dwelling's small lodges, smoke curling from chimneys, dogs barking softly. His people were wary, their eyes sharp and assessing. They had seen outsiders before, and each one brought a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Taza's expression hardened slightly, his body shifting protectively in front of Eleanor. "Stay," he said softly. "Watch, wait." Eleanor nodded, understanding instinctively that this was a test, not of her, but of him. She had seen the same watchfulness in his eyes when they were pursued by Sweetwater. Now it was aimed inward, assessing the unknown, the acceptance of his people. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, until he was fully visible to the elders. Eleanor followed his lead, staying just behind, allowing him to speak for both of them. The elders' eyes narrowed, measuring, cautious. One of them, a tall, weathered man with deep lines etched across his face, spoke in a low, commanding tone. Eleanor didn't understand the words, but she understood the weight behind them. Taza responded in kind, steady, deliberate, explaining something in measured tones. Eleanor noticed the flicker of surprise in the elder's eyes as he gestured toward her. It was not anger or accusation, but something softer, an explanation that carried truth. "She saved me," he said finally, in English that the elders could understand. "She kept me alive. I owe her life. She stays." The pause that followed felt eternal. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She had never imagined being vouched for by an Apache warrior, especially one so feared, respected, and unyielding. Then, slowly, the elders' expressions softened. Some nodded. Others murmured among themselves. One stepped forward, offering Eleanor a gesture of acceptance, not quite warmth, but recognition. Taza turned to her then, and for the first time, his expression softened completely. Relief, pride, and a quiet tenderness mingled in his dark eyes. "You safe," he said simply, the words carrying more meaning than any of the phrases he had spoken before. Eleanor's lips trembled, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had survived the storm, the harsh forest, and the hunters from Sweetwater. But standing here, in the place he called home, feeling the cautious acceptance of a new world, she understood something profound. She was no longer alone. Over the following days, Eleanor began to adapt to life in the settlement. She learned to help with small tasks, to carry water from the stream, to gather herbs, to weave simple cloths. Every day, Taza guided her gently, never rushing, always patient. And with each lesson, each shared task, she felt herself growing stronger, more confident, more capable, yet never entirely separate from him. For Taza, the transformation was quieter, less visible. But Eleanor noticed the subtle changes, the way he smiled when she completed a task, the way he lingered longer in conversation, the way his eyes softened whenever she looked up at him. Spring had brought renewal to the land, but it had also brought renewal to something much deeper between them, a fragile, tender bond that neither could deny. And Eleanor realized, with a certainty that took her breath away, that whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges the future held, she would face them with Taza by her side. Together they had survived winter. Together they would thrive in spring. Spring had settled over the mountains, the snow melting into rushing streams and the air alive with the scent of new growth. Eleanor had begun to feel the pulse of life in ways she hadn't known were possible. The cabin in the woods had been a place of survival, necessity and danger, But here in Taza's homeland, life was something else entirely, a rhythm of dawns and dusks, of work and rest, of shared moments that began to linger in her heart. First, Eleanor had worried about her place among Taza's people. She was pale, delicate, untested by the harsh ways of the mountains and the customs of the tribe. But they had watched her quietly, seen her care for Taza when he had been wounded, and understood that her heart was steadfast. Slowly, they allowed her into their routines, helping with chores, weaving, gathering herbs, tending to small animals. With each passing day, Eleanor felt herself becoming part of a community that had once felt impossible to enter. But it was Taza who held her attention most. The days they spent together were filled with quiet lessons: how to ride swiftly along narrow paths, how to track the signs of wildlife, how to read the forest in ways she had never imagined. He spoke little of his feelings, yet Eleanor could feel the weight of his attention in every glance, every hand hovering near hers when she struggled, every small gesture of care that spoke volumes. One afternoon, as the sun spilled gold over the ridge, Eleanor was gathering herbs near a brook. She had been studying the patterns of the water, trying to mimic Taza's precision when he approached, silent as the breeze. He knelt beside her and, without a word, pointed to a cluster of plants. She followed, realizing that each motion was a lesson not only in survival but in trust. When their hands brushed over the same sprig of sage, Eleanor felt a jolt of something unfamiliar and thrilling. She looked up at him, and for the first time, the protective, commanding presence of Taza was accompanied by a softness in his eyes that mirrored her own feelings. She felt her breath catch, her heart pounding with an acknowledgement she had been too afraid to name. Later, sitting by the fire, Eleanor dared to speak. "I've never been wanted anywhere," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been overlooked, forgotten, invisible." Taza's hand hovered near hers for a long moment before resting gently over it. "You wanted," he said simply. "By me." The words, so few, so deliberate, struck Eleanor like a blow softened only by their tenderness. She had survived hunger, cold, and fear. But now she realized that the storm within her heart, the loneliness she had carried for decades, was finally giving way. She felt her cheeks flush, warmth creeping over her in a way the sun never could. From that day forward, their bond deepened in subtle, undeniable ways. They laughed quietly over shared work, exchanged glances filled with understanding, and relied on one another in ways that went beyond survival. Eleanor found herself anticipating his presence, noticing the small shifts in his demeanor, feeling the tug of affection and desire that had been long buried in her chest. Taza, in turn, began to lean into the trust she offered, allowing himself moments of closeness he had once denied the world. In the silent communication of hands brushing, of shared tasks, of glances held too long to be casual, they both discovered something dangerous and irresistible. Love. By the time the first flowers bloomed along the mountain paths, Eleanor understood the truth. She had loved him first, quietly, without words, without confession. And now, with the mountains as witness and the tribe's cautious approval, she realized that Taza's heart, once guarded and closed, had begun to answer her own. They had survived winter together. They had fled danger together. And now, in the renewal of spring, Eleanor and Taza had discovered a love neither had expected, but both had always needed. Spring had fully arrived in the mountains, painting the world in green and gold. Streams sparkled with melted snow, wildflowers dotted the slopes, and the sun poured warmth into the small lodges of Taza's people. Eleanor had grown stronger in these weeks, learning to weave, gather herbs, ride horses along narrow ridges, and live in a rhythm far different from the quiet, lonely life she had known in Sweetwater. But nothing in her days of survival could have prepared her for the life she had found with Taza, nor for the profound realization of love growing quietly, inevitably, between them. One morning, a distant sound carried across the valley, the unmistakable clatter of hooves. Eleanor's heart tightened. Sweetwater's men had not forgotten them. They had likely tracked them or sent word that the Apache had escaped the cabin and fled into the wilderness. She froze, expecting confrontation, fear, or the terrible threat of being dragged back to the world she had once known. Taza moved without hesitation, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Do not worry," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "We together, safe." The riders emerged into the clearing, and Eleanor's fears crystallized. 3 men from Sweetwater, rifles in hand, eyes scanning for the woman they had dismissed as the old maid and the Apache they had wanted dead. But when they approached the lodges, they found something they had not anticipated. Taza stepped forward, strong and tall, his shoulders still healing but his presence commanding. Eleanor stood beside him, no longer timid, no longer afraid. Her gaze met the men's with quiet defiance. They had expected fear. They found courage. "You will not take her," Taza said in measured, deliberate English, the words carrying authority that brooked no argument. "She is mine. She chooses to stay." The men hesitated, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. They had counted on townsfolk loyalty, on the power of numbers, on the fear of the unknown. But here, in the heart of the Apache territory, the world had shifted. They were outsiders. And Eleanor, once overlooked and dismissed, was no longer a helpless figure. They saw a woman who would not be moved. A partner standing beside a warrior, equal in courage. Unafraid of consequence, one of the men spat in the snow, muttering curses, but Taza did not waver. Eleanor's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally, a silent declaration of unity. The men realized there was nothing they could do. With a final glare, they turned and rode back toward Sweetwater, leaving the mountains and the pair behind in quiet defeat. Eleanor exhaled, trembling, relief flooding her body. Taza turned to her then, and for the first time she saw a full, unguarded smile on his face, a smile that carried warmth, affection, and something she had never dared to hope for, contentment. "You safe?" he said, his voice steady yet tender. "And I'm not going anywhere," she whispered back. Her heart soaring, the mountains became their sanctuary, their new beginning. Eleanor learned to navigate the world as part of Taza's life, and Taza learned slowly that the love he had once denied himself could be shared without weakness. They laughed, worked, and rested together. The cabin that had once held them in fear had become a distant memory. The wilderness that had threatened them had become a home, and in the quiet moments, when the sun set and painted the valley in gold and rose, Taza would hold Eleanor close. She would rest her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and know that she was safe, wanted, and loved. He had been locked in a cabin with the town's old maid, expecting only survival, perhaps resentment, perhaps indifference. Instead, he had found something deeper than freedom. He had found love, and a life he never wanted to leave. And Eleanor, the woman who had been overlooked, dismissed, and abandoned by her world, had found a home and a heart that would never let her go. Together, they faced the spring and every season to come, unshaken, unafraid, and unbreakably bound.